history instructor here at Berkeley City College, and he's done some research on Rosie the Riveter and other aspects of California history. This is Sam Redmond. Sam is an academic specialist, is that correct?
That's correct.
At the Regional Oral History Office at the Bancroft Library, and he's interviewed a number of women who were Rosie the Riveters. And this is Betty Reed Soskin. She works at Rosie the Riveter National Historical Park. Did I get that correct? Okay. And they're each going to speak to us for about 10 minutes about their work and experience with Rosie the Riveter. And then after that, they'll sit here where you see them and answer any questions that you have. And Chuck is going to go first, and then Sam, and then Betty.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for asking me. I see a lot. Do I really need the?
Yeah.
You do? Okay. See a lot of familiar faces here. Just want you pay students to know that on Saturday morning when I wake up around 6:30, I think of you all getting up to go to the 8 o'clock class, and then I smile and turn over and go back to sleep. But next semester I'm going to have to teach Anyway, you know, back during World War II, the San Francisco Chronicle called World War II the California's second gold rush. You know, the first gold rush back in 1849 completely transformed California. And the Chronicle, I think, rightfully said that the only event in California history that can compare in its impact to the gold rush was World War II. The war was the first really major war the United States fought in the Pacific, and California, being the most populous and developed state along the Pacific, became the staging ground really for that war. And literally billions of federal dollars were poured into the California economy. That was when, you know, $1 billion was real money. And a lot of that money went into defense industries, to production. And here in the Bay Area, the industry that was most dramatically affected was the shipbuilding industry. In 1939, in the Bay Area, there were about 5,000 men working in Bay Area shipyards. In 1944, 5 years later, there were 250,000 men and women working in Bay Area shipyards. In 5 years, the shipyard labor force had grown by 50 times. During World War II, the Bay Area was the biggest shipbuilding center the world has ever seen. More tons of ship were built by more people faster than anywhere else in the world before or since. Existing shipyards like the Moore Shipbuilding Company in Oakland went from 600 employees in 1939 to 30,000 employees in 1944. But even more dramatic were sort of instant shipyards, where the federal government gave literally unlimited amounts of money for private companies to establish new shipyards. In 1940, the Kaiser Shipbuilding Complex in Richmond, 4 interconnected yards, didn't exist. In 1943, the Kaiser Richmond yards alone employed 100,000 people working 24/7. Kaiser yards were the biggest, in 1943 was the biggest shipyard in the world. It hadn't existed three years before. It's the biggest industrial enterprise that has ever existed in the Bay Area before or since. And all this was going on at a time when there were like 12 million people in the armed forces. That's 10 times the size of the armed forces today. And dozens and dozens of other industries were booming too. The labor surplus and high unemployment of the Depression of the 1930s was turned into a labor shortage and no unemployment in places like the Bay Area in the 1940s. I mean, by 1943, if you could pretty much stand up for 8 hours, you could get a job in the Bay Area. And in order to meet this terrible labor shortage, employers like Kaiser had massive nationwide recruiting efforts to bring people from all of the United States into the Bay Area, hundreds of thousands of new workers. Included in that was the first really large migration of African Americans into the Bay Area. San Francisco, for example, in 1940 had just 5,000 black residents. By 1945, it had 25,000 black residents. So in just 5 years, the black population of San Francisco grew by 5 times. Richmond had about 200 black residents in 1940. Then the Kaiser shipyards arrived. By 1945, there were over 10,000 between 10 and 15,000 African American residents in Richmond. By 1945, 70% of the black wage earners in the Bay Area worked in just one industry, the shipbuilding industry. And there were just all sorts of other kids were brought in from high schools to work in the shipyards, the college kids, old people were asked to come back into the employment areas to work in the shipyards. 60% of the members of the San Francisco Symphony worked in the shipyards during the day and then rehearsed their music at night. And the most dramatic example of all of this process of bringing new people into the shipyards was what the film has dealt with, that is bringing women into industrial work. By 1945, over a quarter of the blue-collar industrial workers at the Kaiser shipyard were women. And if you include people who were working in what were considered to be more normal women's occupations like clerical work, about a third or more of the workers at Kaiser by the end of the war, or I say 1944 at least, were women. As the film indicates, even though women went into the workforce, it doesn't mean that that old patterns of discrimination and sexism disappeared. Even though Rosie the Riveter became the kind of symbol of women workers, here in the Bay Area, particularly at places like Kaiser, it probably would be more accurate to talk about Wanda the welder, because there was relatively little riveting done in Bay Area shipyards, but a huge amount of welding. And the great majority of women industrial workers who worked in Bay Area shipyards worked as welders. One shipyard executive said, well, women are really good at welding because it's like sewing, it's putting things together. And again, those kind of stereotypical attitudes were common. Women did get equal pay for equal work within individual job categories by federal law, but promotion of women really was not the same as promotion of men. At the Marine shipyard in Sausalito, there was just one woman who served as a foreman out of 4,000 or 5,000 women workers. But she was also the only woman who served as a foreman in any shipyard in the Bay Area. And as far as I can tell, she was the only woman who served as a foreman in any shipyard in the United States out of 160,000 women shipyard workers. And there were no women in any kind of important management positions in any Bay Area shipyards. And as the film indicated, as the shipyard production began to decline in 1945, women who had often been the last hired were the first laid off, the first fired. Even though there are all those things in the film of women saying, I want to get back to the household and I want to get back to my traditional way of life. In fact, public opinion polls that were done during the war showed that the overwhelming majority of women workers wanted to stay in those well-paid industrial jobs, but in almost no case were they able to. In the Bay Area, virtually all of the great bulk of the shipyard labor force had already pretty much declined in the Bay Area by 1946. The Kaiser Yard closed down in 1946, and all but just a token few numbers of women lost those shipyard jobs. But and for a little while, the number of women in the workforce actually went down right after World War II. But by 1950, the numbers of women in the workforce was as high or even higher than it had been back in 1945. The difference was women were back in what you might call, quote unquote, women's work. Women's wages were just a little over half of men's wages by 1950. So that even though the total amount of women in the workforce, and even the percentage of women in the workforce, was about the same as it had been during World War II, that gap between men and women's wages had been kind of restored back to its traditional level. But I don't think that means that the effect of women labor in the workforce during the war was all in vain. One African-American shipyard worker said, African-American woman shipyard worker said, it was Adolf Hitler that got us out of the white man's kitchen. It got us out of those domestic jobs. And the precedent of women workers during World War II remained a powerful And so in the late 60s and 70s, when a kind of new era of women's activism and feminist activity occurred, that precedent was still there, and it established the basis for more successful long-range demands for equality of women in the workforce. As some of you know, I could go on and talk like this for 2 or 3 hours, but I think there are probably other people who are more interesting speakers. So let me stop and go to the next speakers. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank Berkeley City College for inviting me here today to comment on this film and share some of my work with you. My name is Sam Redman, and I am the lead interviewer for the Rosie the Riveter World War II American Homefront Oral History Project at the Regional Oral History Office of the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. Did you guys get all of that? That's my job title. So as lead interviewer on an oral history project, what I do is mainly interview women and men who lived in the United States during World War II. And what I'd like to do today is just take a little time to tell you a little bit about this project and how it can work to critique some of the arguments that we see in this film today, The Life and Times of Rosie the Riveter. Our project has interviewed around 130 men and women who lived in the United States during World War II. We have especially strong collections related to the shipyards in the Bay Area, which Chuck told us about so well earlier. The shipyards and the dry docks served as the primary impetus that brought over 150,000 workers from around the nation to the San Francisco Bay Area. It's really hard to underestimate the transformative impact that that had on the Bay Area during the Second World War. Of course, in our collection, we have dozens of interviews with women who are proud to call themselves Rosie the Riveter. These women worked in factories and plants to build ships, airplanes, tanks, jeeps, and munitions. This collection, therefore, will be crucially important for the future of women's history, focusing on this moment in time in U.S. history. In addition to documenting this important moment in women's history, our project boasts an impressive collection with interviews with minority groups, including African Americans, American Indians, and Mexican Americans. Now, one of the things that I'd like to mention in sort of response to the film is that it's important to understand that many of these groups had never really interacted before in the way that they were expected to in places like the shipyards. So when you see a lot of the racial tension or the racial mixing or sort of learning about other cultures and other groups, this was a pretty drastic moment for a lot of these individuals and something that turned their lives sort of upside down. So that's something that I'd like for us to consider as we have our discussion today. Our project has generated support from the National Park Service and the City of Richmond, and our relationship with both of these both the City of Richmond and the National Park Service has been unbelievably fulfilling and really worthwhile. Now, what is oral history? So professional oral histories result in transcripts or typewritten copies of the interview, as well as audio and video excerpts of those interviews. So serious researchers and students such as yourselves can ask for permission to view the unedited video, and the general public is welcome to view the edited copies of, or the lightly edited copies of the transcripts. Now, those transcripts are also placed in the UCLA Library, the Richmond Public Library, and with the National Park Service. And you can view them online at the Bancroft Library website. All right, so as I said, it's really hard to underestimate the enormity of the change brought to California by World War II. But one of the things I'd like to mention is that the change was not only in terms of people acquiring jobs, okay? So the change was also social and cultural and religious, and then it changed the racial landscape of the Bay Area as well. So what did this mean? This meant new kinds of music, new kinds of food, new attitudes about sex and sexuality, politics, clothing, and money. And we sort of had a good chuckle when we saw women changing out of clothes and then putting on what they called, the narrator said, well, they look just like business women now leaving the factory. Well, that actually was a really important thing for people to have lockers because what the clothing that you wore on the street sort of was a symbol of who you were as a worker, as an individual, what your status was. So, you know, it sort of cut both ways. Some women would be proud to wear their blue jeans, their Levi's jeans. I mean, I'm wearing Levi's right now, but for a lot of women, they'd never owned Levi's jeans before, and getting a job at the shipyard meant that they would get blue jeans. And wearing pants, for them, signaled that they were part of this community. Now, on the other hand, many women wanted to not maybe look like they had industry jobs, so they would change into these clothes. So you have sort of these competing attitudes about things like clothing that we're trying to address in our interviews. Hundreds of new businesses opened, responding to the needs of new migrants to the Bay Area. Dry cleaners, bars, gambling joints all seem to open overnight. Now, in cities like Richmond, this is really hard to imagine. Chicken coops were replaced with restaurants and movie theaters. So people in the Bay Area would have, before World War II, they might have goats or things like that in their backyard, chickens. And now they were moving to different places and restaurants were coming in. And when we conceive of World War II, Americans, or the American public, sometimes has a tendency to think of a few groups of people. Notably, we're taught about Rosie the Riveter, and this is an image of a white, female, middle-class woman who goes to replace the man at work when they're away at war. And this iconic image represents a movement that's thought to belong to the modern feminist movement. And this is a tenuous claim at best. The war itself, in turn, is thought of as the good war, won by the will and skill of the hard-fighting American GI. And again, this is an overly simplistic image. And when we think of post-war life, we think of this utopian America that emerges in the 1950s, supported by the bedrock of the GI Bill, which gave a home and a family and 2.5 perfect kids to all families across the country. And unfortunately, this, as we see in the film, this idyllic portrait of war is not accurate for everyone. Although I would like to say that there is this overwhelming desire that we see in a number of these interviews for normalcy and stability. Now you have to understand, I mean, as you guys are living through an economic recession, for many of these people, they had grown up in the Great Depression. And they'd also then been thrown into the midst of this worldwide war where many of their husbands and brothers and cousins and everyone else had been sent away. And for many of these people, all they wanted after the war concluded was stability and sort of this return to what they wanted, what they viewed as a normal life. Many women did want to continue working, and as we saw, many of those jobs simply disappeared. But the other side of the story is that many women did want their husbands to return home, they did want a home, they did want to move out to the suburbs, and they did want that sort of idealized image that was being presented to them. So there is another side of that coin that I don't think is fully presented in the film. What I'd like to say that is at the end of the war, many temporary gains for women, many gains for unions, and gains for minorities were rolled back. So for women, in particular, jobs, healthcare, and childcare were all lost at the end of the war. And now, again, when they talk about in the film, some of these things had rolled back and soldiers were given these jobs. One of the things that I think the film misses that we need to remember is that at the end, not only were we emerging from the Great Depression, but at the end of the First World War, when the men had returned home, what they had found was that many of them didn't have jobs. So this led to a fairly massive economic crisis that is overshadowed by the Great Depression. So I believe there was a very real concern for many of these folks that made that decision. Now that's not to say that these rollbacks were in any way correct, but what I'm saying is that there are ways to sort of understand why these decisions were made. Now for unions, new laws were reacted to the growing strength of unions in wartime factories, and unions were viewed with skepticism that applied to communism. So as you saw in the film, communism and unions were often tied together by critics. For minorities, the rhetoric of war and patriotism exposed a deep disparity between the American dream and the reality for people of color. And one thing I'd like to reference here is the Double Victory campaign. So for a lot of people of color during the war, they saw it as not only were we fighting Nazi Germany, and not only were we fighting Japan, but we were fighting racism at home. So this idea was applied with a double victory campaign. So there were songs about double victory. Women would even have hairstyles that were basically a V in their hairstyle. So that's an important sort of campaign to remember. So I'd like to conclude just by saying that I don't intend to be a downer today, but our positive and celebratory popular memory of Rosie the Riveter as this sort of strong and morally pure woman hard at work for the boys overseas is not entirely inaccurate, but instead it does gloss over the many complexities of this era. And those to me are the most important thing, and that's what we're trying to get at with these interviews. My understanding is that for the background of this film is that these few women were chosen out of hundreds of interviews. And of course the filmmakers wanted to choose engaging and interesting people to feature in their story. And they also have a perspective of their own, which is unique and important to remember. And despite the weaknesses of the film that portrays this period in a particular light, we can still learn much from these interviews. And so what I hope that you guys will do is go home and go to your computers, and if you would Google Rosie the Riveter Oral History Project, we're the top hit, and we're hoping to build a collection of somewhere between 200 and 500 oral histories with a wide variety of individuals. And hopefully students like yourselves will go to these interviews and explore them online and hopefully find some interesting insights to this important period in American history. Thank you.
Did you want us to show your DVD piece first? Do you want us to try that first? I can try it. Betty has
Let me introduce this.
Okay, go ahead.
Thanks for inviting me. I have the reputation of being the oldest park ranger in the entire nation. I'm in my 89th year. That's important because I think sometimes my main role rises from the fact that I know how all the stories turned out. And I also have outlived all of the people whose version of reality differs from mine. I came in to this Rosie the Riveter homefront national park almost in protest. I lived the period, was employed by a Jim Crow union, the Boilermakers Auxiliary 36, because at that time the unions, well known for their introduction of liberal politics, were not yet racially integrated. I saw Rosie the Riveter as a white woman's story, and I didn't identify with it at all. I lived the period never having seen a ship. Our union hall was about at 16th and Barrett in Richmond, a long way from the shipyards. I filed cards and changed addresses and cashed checks. As far as I was concerned, all of the workers that I was exposed to were black. Mine was a very different view of the war, or the home front. It remains such. My attitude is so colored by my race that for a long time it was hard for me to find my place in this narrative. I've learned more about that period since I've become a park ranger than I ever did living it. Because that reality came from a time when I was one of those African Americans in place, having come to California as a result of the flooding of New Orleans in 1927 at the age of 6, never having lived under a system of segregation, and suddenly having the world change under my feet in 1941. So I had pretty much X'd out all of that history that was too painful to recall. When I was introduced to the parks, I was serving as a field representative of Assemblywoman Dion Arender. I was in charge of all of the 5 cities of West Contra Costa. As such, was sitting in on the planning meetings for this newly established park as it was being planned, because the property under one of the scattered sites, the Ford Building, had been built on air rights, on land that was owned by the state of California. So I sat in on those meetings, not feeling related to the story, but becoming familiar with all of the sites that in the legislation had been set aside to establish this park, and recognizing them gradually as all being the sites of segregation. Because in his recruitment, Henry Kaiser, for his 4 shipyards, had sent out his recruiters mainly to the 5 southern states of Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Mississippi, and Texas, bringing together workers, black and white, who would not be sharing drinking fountains, or schools, or hospitals, or public accommodations of any kind, or even cemeteries, for another 20 years back in their places of origin, and inadvertently transferred the complete system of racial segregation into the greater Bay Area. Can you imagine the kinds of changes that those of us in place were experiencing? In those early days, as a way of explaining myself in context with this park, I began to volunteer. Eventually, found myself as a contract worker. But I found that even though in Richmond there was a 40% black population at the time, because the inner city had filled in, there were few, if any, black faces at those beginning organizational meetings. At the first such meeting that I attended as a field rep, I heard the superintendent, who was accompanying the PowerPoint presentation, make the statement that the National Parks Service's mission in the creation of this park, having discovered that there are more still standing structures related to the World War II mobilization in Richmond than any other place in the country, that this was a site that had been chosen for that reason. But I recognized all of the sites as places of segregation. And that as an American, now within the system in midlife, I had an obligation to point out what was happening. That we were setting aside sites in the Bay Area that were going to tell a story that would leave my history out. Because all of the sites that would have told the story of the African American experience had been destroyed immediately when the war ended. My Union Hall, the projects where blacks had lived, in some cases were torn down with 24 hours notice, with people with nowhere to go. because those 98,000 people who were brought to the sites of the 4 Richmond shipyards had to be cut to 10,000 without warning, because no one knew when the war was going to end. I put together, in those early days, a 4-minute DVD in order to try to get the National Park Service to see that though Ken Burns had told the story of World War II, that the great story of the home front had never really been told in all of its complexity, and that there were many, many stories beside Rosie the Riveter that needed to be told. That there was a story of Japanese-American internment, the stories of the Bracero, the story of African-American migration in huge numbers, the story of the most extraordinary, ordinary man with an 8th grade education who had never built a ship, but by war's end would have built 747 ships in 3 years and 8 months with a crew of sharecroppers. Let's say that again, 747 ships in 3 years and 8 months, which means that he revolutionized shipbuilding, though he had never built a ship. There were so many stories to be told. This was the greatest mobilization since the building of the pyramids. It took 7 people at home to support every person on the front. As an example of one of those stories, I'd like to share with you the 4-minute DVD that gives you the story, at least a part of the story, from an African-American perspective. So you get a sense of the differing realities and the need for us to, at some point, hear those voices of the Bracero, of the Japanese Americans, of members of feminist white Rosies, because there is a story there that needs telling and it's separate from mine. But you need my story there as well. I'd like to refer back to something that Sam said. There was so much made of the GI Bill because it guaranteed each returning veteran a home and education, providing that veteran was coming home to a school that would accept him. The GI Bill was administered locally and not federally, which meant that the local banker could determine who could have mortgages. There are so many untold stories and lost conversations, and by creating this park and giving us a chance to revisit that era, as I said in the film, supported by our experience of the 60s, supported with new legislation that was created out of that period, things, social legislation that came about because of the years from 1941 to 1945, that are still reverberating out of the greater Bay Area and crossing the country. This is not only the edge of the continent, it's the edge of social change. It's the home of the atom bomb. It's the home of the United Nations. If we remember the leadership that we will provide, this park allows us to revisit the birth of that social legislation, and we can go back there and reconstruct those stories. And we're hoping that your school will help us to do that, because it takes about 20 years to develop an urban national park. We're in our 10th year now. Well, let me give you all my answer to that for some context. My great-grandmother was born into slavery in 1846, was enslaved until she was 19. She lived to be 102, which meant that when she died in 1948, I was a grown woman of 27 years old, so that I knew my slave ancestor. My mother, who my slave ancestor, my great-grandmother raised, was born in 1894 and died in 1995 at 101. What this means is that in the lives of 3 women, all of whom knew each other, it's all of that American history. That the full range of my life means that I've gone from Mama's slavery, enslavement, to Obama's inauguration, where I'm sitting on the Capitol Mall watching the inauguration of the first African-American president. How on earth do you measure that? So that change for me, social change for me, is an absolutely irresistible force. I see all of that as having happened so quickly. You kids are looking up at that. I'm looking back at it. Can you imagine?